On this channel, I specialise in making really complex looking images easy to create. So just follow along with my step-by-step tutorial of this painting and you will amaze yourself. So you can probably apply many of the techniques and the process to whatever app or tablet you happen to be using, but I am using the app Procreate on the iPad, and as such I've opened an A4 canvas. So that's 297mm by 210 at 300 dpi. I've already pre-selected some colours and you can see them in this section. Each of the colours has what we call a hexadecimal code. And if you go to the value section here, you'll see a section where you can type them in one at a time. All of those codes are in the video description. Once you type them in, press enter, the colour appears up here and you can piece it together yourself. Or next to the codes is a link that takes you to my Patreon page and you can download the colour file there for free. In terms of the brushes, today I'm going to be using, within the artistic brushes, the leatherwood brush. Within the organic, I'm going to be using the rainforest brush, and possibly I'll be using within airbrushing the soft brush and the medium brush too, but we will see. If you do like this kind of tutorial, please make sure to give the video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe and also the bell notification to make sure you do get notified of all my future videos too. With all that said and done, let's get started. So on layer 1, I'm going to go to my colours, my first colour, and I'm going to drag that from the circle at the top right into the canvas, and it very simply flood fills the entire canvas. I may as well stay on the same layer initially. I'm going to go back to my colours. I'm going to choose the second colour now, which if you go to the colour disc you can see is very much a blue, but it's a slightly greyed out blue. I'm going to go to my brushes, to the artistic and the leatherwood brush. Now I'm going to tap on the leatherwood brush, go to the grain section, and I'm going to turn this scale down to 0. If I turn the scale up, you'll see exactly what I'm trying to eliminate is this canvas texture. So by turning it to none or 0, you get the general brush shape, but you don't get the grain. And I find it just works a little bit better without it. So with this brush now, I'm going to turn it to about 3% and about 80% on the opacity. So 3% size, 80% opacity. And in the top corner at the left, I'm just going to start adding some downward strokes. And it doesn't matter too much. Now, this brush does vary depending on how hard you press with the Apple Pencil. Now, if you press lightly, you will get a thin stroke. And if you press more, you get a larger scale, much bigger textured look. And that's going to be relevant for what I'm going to be showing you. But initially, you can just do a variety. So you can do some big strokes here, some medium ones, and we can have it going off the edge of the canvas there too. And I'm going to do some more on this side as well. Just some general middle-size strokes. It doesn't matter if there's a few gaps. And I'm going to press on a bit more, do some in this middle section too. Turn it up to 4%, do a few bigger ones in this section specifically. Then I'm going to go to my adjustments, Gaussian blur. I'm going to blur it in initially to about 7%. Then I'm going to turn it down to back down to about the 3% again. Stay at the 80% strength opacity. Within those sections, I'm just going to start adding more. So perhaps a little bit lighter on the strokes now. So I'm kind of working in the shapes that we've already created. You can do some more on top, but it's okay to press a little bit more lightly and you're adding more kind of streaks and texture within what we've already got. But we don't need to do too much more really. And then some in this top section too. We do want to preserve some of the darker colour background, so don't want to do too much. Then we'll just go to the Gaussian blur again within adjustments and just blur it in, this time to about 5%. We're just creating some variety. Then I'm going to create another layer. Go back to my colours. I'm going to choose the third colour in now, which is very similar, just a little bit lighter. I'm going to have my brush still at 3%, but I'm going to turn the strength, the opacity down to about 40%. And I'm going to press not too hard, but sort of middle. So it's not as hard as it could be, and equally it's not as light as it could be. So I could go with a thinner stroke or a thicker stroke, and you can see that's somewhere in the middle. So you might have to practice the strength of these pressures. So I'm aiming there, and then I can just do a few in this area too. Have it a bit more broken perhaps. But importantly, I don't want to do every area. I don't want to go over every part. with this lighter colour. So I'm using it a bit more sparingly. Compress it a couple of times here and there, but maybe over this section I need to do a bit more of this. So I'm pressing a bit more. Maybe when we come lower down, I can press a bit more. And this is going to be a feature of this technique, is that we press a little bit more lightly at the top, so it's thinner, and as it gets lower down, we get a thicker stroke. So you start by pressing light, and then you press on a bit more as we go further down. Light, and then press more. Light, and then press more. And we'll continue doing this. This is all going to be obscured anyway, so don't worry too much about that. You can go over it a few times, something like this, and then perhaps we'll leave a section where we don't need to go over it too much. Then go over it here, just keep practicing that technique a little bit. Could always turn it up, back up to like the 4%, get some bigger shapes coming in there as well. And just maybe one or two over here at the bottom section. Then we're going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, blur it in to about the 8%, looks good. Create a new layer, go to our brushes, use the soft brush, and on our colours I'm going to use the third colour in again. I'm going to put the brush to 15% size and the opacity to 100%, and halfway on my canvas now I'm just going to draw a stripe across. Then go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur it in to about 80%. Then I'm going to create a new layer, go to the fifth colour along this time. I'm going to skip the grey colour, I'm going to go to the slightly lighter colour, go back to the artistic, and I'm going to skip to the organic and rainforest brush. I'm going to put the brush size at around 6% and the strength at about 50%. And I'm just going to do a few gestures over here, and then a few in this center area too. We can bring it down because we're going to cover most of this with brighter colors anyway, and then just a couple up in this area as well. Just a suggestion of it like that. Maybe turn it down to about 20% and turn the brush size up to about 10%, and maybe just a couple more taps up here as well. Then I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur again, and blur it in to about the 10%. Then I'm going to create a new layer. I'm going to go to my brushes, airbrushing, medium brush, change my colour back to the original colour that we used, which if we were applying it straight at the top you wouldn't see it very much, but we're going to be applying it here, so it's going to appear much darker again. But I'm going to turn the brush size down to about 2% and the opacity, the strength, to about 80%. And I'm just going to start claiming some sections, some rocks that are sticking out near the top. We're okay to leave some of these shapes we've just created to stick out, but I certainly want to create some rocks that stick out as well. Maybe a nice rock here, and then we can turn the brush size up, put it more like 10%, and then we can just fill in downwards from that point. As long as we've got our edge, that's the most important thing, and then we can just go down, maybe back down again to the 2% if I just want to add a little bit more refined detail here. It's going to be covered up with water spray, but I can just add a little bit more here as well, and the same to the other side. So I just want to do some rock features that interrupt the waterfall and stick out still, and then downwards here, and then I can move them along here as well. We're going to cover them with trees and bushes and things, so you don't need to be too worried about the shapes. They will be refined with other colours anyway. So we'll just block them in initially, something like this. So pretty rough, and that's fine. I might just also swap to the artistic leatherwood brush again, and using a brush size of about 2% and back up to about the 80% as well. I'm just going to create some sections here, perhaps where we have some bushes and trees just along this edge too. So we're going to see like the silhouette top edge of the shapes. So we're going to have some breaks and little features there just interrupting along here. And perhaps I'll just blur it in slightly. So I'll go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and just blur it in a couple of percent, no more than that. I'm going to go and create a new layer. I'm going to go back to my colours, and I'm going to choose this first green on the bottom row. And I'm going to use the the organic rainforest brush, but I'm going to have it quite low. It's about 3% size and about 40% opacity strength. And I'm just going to start tapping in some suggestions of this green in this area to begin with. Doesn't matter if it's going to be covered up by water, it just keeps it easy. Just block in some areas generally. We don't want to completely fill it. I'm just doing it quite randomly, leaving gaps. The gaps are just as important as the green itself, so don't just completely fill in every little area. You want to create some broken textures. So that will do for that side, and I'm going to continue on this side too, just to get something in there initially, and we're going to add a lot of brighter greens over the top anyway, so it doesn't really matter. Something like this. Then I'm going to turn it down even further to about the 20% and turn it down to the lowest part of 2% size, and just then almost so you can't see it, but in this lower section you've got some very subtle textures that really, once we get the brighter colours in here, you're not going to notice too much, and that's fine. It's a subtle element, and I think it will work. And we'll just create lots of little dashes, just so when we add other things over the top, although this is not going to be very prominent, it just doesn't look so flat, it doesn't look featureless. There's a sense that there's little textures in there, and it doesn't look completely lifeless. Okay, so we'll create another layer. Back to our greens, second green along this time, and at 2% size still, and perhaps up a little bit more again, so about 40% again on the strength, the opacity, and we can just start piecing in some lighter greens now, and perhaps let's just make sure it's really as narrow as possible, so not quite the 1%, just a little bit up into the 2%, and then we can start bringing in some more vibrant greens now into this scene. But again, we don't need to go too over the top. I'm just bringing in hints more of it. Now the light is going to be strongly from above, and it's just going to shine on the edges of these bushes and trees, this foliage, so it's just going to highlight the very edge, so you can almost describe the outer shape of these things growing. And perhaps we'll just do them a little bit more vividly over this side. So along this top edge we're just going to have the highlights. Make sure to leave gaps. The gaps are, like I was saying before, equally as important as the highlights. So the highlights there need to have a contrast, so they need the dark to remain in places, and we just want to create some kind of separation so that it looks like there's bushes and trees and things growing in these areas. And we're not going to treat it evenly too. We're going to have some areas where we have more of a vibrant green and other areas where we have more of a dull set of colours, so it's slightly more in shadow perhaps. And then we're obviously going to interrupt it with water spilling over different places too. So at this stage we're really quite rough. We don't need to be especially detailed. We'll do a little bit more detail as we go. Now with the slightly lighter green, it's really useful to add a little bit more sharpness, but this is still in the 2%, it's not at the 1%. And with the next green in a moment, perhaps we'll reduce the size of the brush to 1% and just really be a bit more refined. So we'll do that now. We will create another layer, go to the third colour along this time, reduce it down to the 1% size, and even put it up to about 60% strength, opacity. And I'm just going to use this now really to sharpen up some of these details and edges. Now I don't zoom in on these tutorials because I want to create the impression rather than the every tiny leaf on every tree or every bush. So the 1% is pretty much detailed for what we need, especially at the A4 canvas size. That will work for us. I'm just going around now creating some highlights on some of these top edges. Maybe create a separation here between a bit that goes back and then a bit that comes forward. And these highlights and edges are really useful for creating that effect, pushing things forward and pushing things back. Like I say, just you can probably hear I'm creating quite a series of taps for these shapes. It is a little bit more time consuming. Now because we use the the rainforest texture, it gives us generally a starting point for these textures. So you're not creating all of it entirely from imagination. The brush itself has created some of these shapes and textures, so you're just going around some of them now, and it gave us a really nice starting point and has significantly sped up the process and helped us out. So just a few more around here, and we want really quite a nice highlighted section here, and then this bit because it's a change of angle, it's going to be largely in the shadow. So we want a big separation between what we see here, and then suddenly this face is not going to be getting as much sunlight. So I'll do a little bit more over on this side as well, but I want to perhaps keep a section maybe a slightly more in shadow. I think that would work. So we'll just have a section over here that's catching the light a little bit, because I'm going to certainly add a lot of light colour for the water, and then just a section here to correspond with that. So this is also going to be catching the light, so you can see the more vibrant greens and details in this little section, but then maybe I'll allow it to just disappear off over here. So again, it's about changing angles, but also shadows. You don't always need to know exactly what's creating the shadow or the angles, but just to create a little bit of variation goes a long way. And your imagination can kind of fill in the details a little bit, really. Okay, I might come back and add a little bit more detail to those areas, but I'm going to create another layer. And I'm going to go back to my artistic leatherwood brush, and I'm going to go back to this third colour in as well on the top row. I'm going to have the brush size at the lowest part of 2% and really quite low at around 20% strength opacity. And over in this section, I'm just going to have a few little trickles of water that might be spilling over in certain sections, emerging from the trees perhaps, the bushes, and just having some small sections of water that's just trickling down. And then we're going to have bigger sections obviously, but this is just a subtle detail. And then maybe when it starts to hit the rocks a little bit further down, we get a little bit more of the froth, more noticeable, but not too much because we're going to cover this section up with more bushes and trees anyway. Maybe one or two over here, but not much. Again, this is largely in shadow, this bit, so we don't need to worry too much. I'm just going to increase the size of the brush up to 3%. And the important thing with this brush is if you press lightly, you get a thin stroke, but if you press on a lot, you get a much thicker, broader stroke. So you can vary it just by the pressure that you use. So I'm only pressing lightly, and we're getting quite thin strokes like that. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to change colours now to this colour at the end of the top row. We're going to use this colour in combination with the other colours, but it just gives a slightly warmer look to the water. In the background, we've got much cooler colours, and this is a slightly warmer effect because the sun is interacting with the water and it just creates a bit more warmth. So we're going to keep it at the 3% size and 20% opacity, and I'm just going to start lightly bringing in water that's cascading over the top there, like this. Now I can press on a lot like I showed you and it creates bigger textures, but we're just at where it starts from up here. I'm going to press lightly initially, and I'm going to build up the effect by going over it a lot of times. As we get further down, we can press on more, and then as we go over and over it, you start to get a build up of that colour and this splash effect, which works really well for us. I'm going to go to another section, again press on lightly as we come down, just as a thin shape, and then I can go over it, and another one, and then maybe as it comes further down I can press on a little bit more, and we just keep building it up like this really. So imagine there's a bit of a shelf here where it's coming from, so I can do a line across very lightly, and all the water's pouring over from that point. So I can just do another line lightly, and as it comes further down I can press a little bit more and allow it to disperse and separate. Then another one lightly, and as it comes further down, press on a little bit more, lightly, press on a little bit more, and just keep building it up like that really. And keep going over it lightly, press on more, lightly for the first section, then press on more, lightly, then press on more, and keep building it up. And we can even just go over that bottom section. It's going to be largely covered in lighter colours anyway, so I might as well just build up the light effect. And then I'm going to have some over here. So it's almost like you've got little sections of rock that are just getting sandwiched and water's pouring out either side, and that will work nicely. And then it all just mingles together in this centre area. We can allow it to just gather together in this middle bit. So I can just go over this a little bit, that's fine. I'm going to use a whiter colour to really separate some of the shapes anyway, later on. And I'll choose another section here perhaps to have some more parts that just spill over so lightly until we get further down, and then I can press on a bit more. So you're varying the pressure from a light, slightly more, slightly more, slightly more as you go further down. And go over it a few times and keep practicing that technique. It's a really useful brush for this. Now, if you see my recent video, I talked about my favorite brushes. So I listed 5 of my favorite brushes in Procreate, and this is one of them because it just does so many different kinds of textures really. It's useful in so many situations that it's just one of my favorite brushes. And once I make sure it's highlighted more at the top as well, because it's facing upwards, so the sun is going to catch it that little bit more. And the same in this section over here too. It's just going to catch the light more. We can build it up a little bit. We'll go over it with another brush as well, don't worry. I'll just do a little bit more of this kind of splash in this bottom section. And that will do with this side for now, but it's not finished. I'm going to go over it with other effects too. And then we can start to just build in something similar over on this side. So lightly press, just build out the general areas and shapes. And then once you're happy with it, you can press on a bit more and it build in all of this break in the water so it becomes bigger, more dramatic shapes. And then just refine it a little bit more where it emerges. So where it emerges from, you're gonna have to press lightly and go over it a few times just to be a bit more precision. And it's really in the bottom sections where you can press on more and it doesn't matter almost how it starts to separate out. Okay. I'm going to blur it in slightly, so I'm going to go to the adjustments, Gaussian blur, and I'll just blur it in initially to about the 5%. Then I'll go to my layers and create a new layer, go to my colors, and I'm going to not use the white as color, but I'm going to go to the third one from the right. And with my soft brush, I can control it a bit more. So airbrushing soft brush, reduce it down to the lowest part of 2% and put it at about 50% strength. And then I can just go into these areas now and I can just start to really control exactly where I want the shapes to go in and around rocks and bushes and trees. And I can just control it a little bit more accurately up in this section. And just along the top edge, so I'll zoom in a tiny bit. I don't zoom in much, but just on this top edge, I can just pick out some highlights perhaps. And the contrast is important. I'm just doing some dots as well, just to create some texture too. We don't want it to be totally smooth. I'm just creating a series of dots to blend in with the other texture that I created. And then I can move on to another section. So at the top where it flattens out, it's really going to catch the light because it's facing upwards again. So when it comes downwards, then it's at a different angle. So it changes from being quite so white and bright to a murkier color. But in these sections, especially if I just do it in with dots and let it become more spaced out as it goes further down, that really works. And it combines with a leatherwood brush really nicely. And again, just a few dots, bringing it down, allow them to disappear. And it's the combination of those textures, I think, that is going to really work for us. So we can keep a couple of features in the water, like a rock that sticks out perhaps and just interrupts. And along this edge, I'm going to keep some brighter highlights too. So I'm just going to go along this edge, add some more bright white to this edge too. I'll go over to this side and just do something similar over here. And I can just pick out some of these shapes too. I want these rocks to really contrast nicely with the background. So I want a very bright sense of colours behind the rocks, but I'm just going in and out of them. And anywhere where it's a top edge, like here, it's just going to catch the light a little bit more, something like this. Okay, I'm going to go back to my layer 4, which had this detail on it. I'm going to create a layer above layer 4. And using the same colour that I've just been using and the soft airbrush, I'm going to increase the size of the soft airbrush to about 4%, and I'm going to reduce this opacity to about 30%. And I'm just going to start going in now and bringing out some brightness in the center area. Generally speaking, it needs to be brighter in this middle bit. So I'm just piecing in some bright, soft color, and it's on a different layer. So I can always use the Gaussian blur or change the effect, and you can see I'm just using an upward stroke with this, just pushing it up until it highlights some of the rocks or creates a contrast with them, and also then just merges with some of the shapes that I've got. I don't want to create all new shapes necessarily, I just want to blend it up into some of these forms like this and up into this section too. Again, I don't want to obliterate anything. Not really creating anything new, it's just bringing out some highlights in the areas we've already got. And it's merging with them, and really quite a nice effect. Okay, I'm going to go to my very top layer again, and I'm going to create a layer on top of that. I'm going to stick on the soft brush with that same color. I'm going to put the brush size up to about 5% and have it at about 20% strength, opacity, and I'm just going to start building in. In fact, we're going to turn the size up even higher, so about 10% size, and I'm just going to build in some mist here, so it's all crashed down the water and it's all created this spray which appears like a fog, like a mist, which just starts to take away some of the details in this bottom section. So I'm just using a circular motion to go around here and build it up, which works really nicely. I'm just going to reduce it again further now, back down to the 2%, keep it at the 20% strength, and I can just start to merge in some of these shapes, bring it down along this edge and have it kind of blend in with this mist down here as well. Go around some of these edges and over here as well, perhaps just upwards, because we're starting with the lightest colour at the bottom. I'll just bring it upwards and just doing a series of dashes to create some turbulence and spray and texture in all of this water. It's all just crashing around and creating a huge amount of spray and texture. So I'm just going in there and just churning it up with this highlight, something like this. Maybe I can just bring it up in this section too. So again, dashes and dots will work for this. I'll create another layer just to keep the textures on separate layers, and also I might want to use the blur with this texture, but I've gone back to the artistic leatherwood brush, 3% size, 20% opacity, and I'm just going to build in a bit more of this texture in here. Again, sort of vary it up so that it's lighter brush strokes near the top, so you're only pressing on a little bit, and then press more as you go further down, and just create that variation. Go over it more near the top area, build it up. We could build some more of it in here as well. Again, it's the combination of some of the textures we were using with the airbrush and this textured brush that the two together I think work really nicely. But I do need to blur this brush in a little bit, so Gaussian blur, blur it in about 5%. I'm going to create a new layer, go to my airbrushing soft brush, put it at around 15% size and about 40% strength, and just along the bottom here I'm going to do a line which I'm then going to go adjustments, Gaussian blur, and blur it in to about the 50%. Just brings a bit of a transition up, which works nicely, and then it means when I create a layer on top I can go back to my medium brush within airbrushing, go back to my dark colour which is here, put it at around 3% size and 80% opacity, and I can start to build in some more foreground features, and it just separates things off from each other a little bit, brings this into the foreground better. And I can just go in and fill this in a little bit, maybe put it 100%, doesn't matter does it, let's fill it in. We'll do something similar on the other side, like this. Stay on the same layer, I'm going to switch back to my organic rainforest brush, go to my colour on the end here which is like a dark orangey brown, put the strength at about 50% and the brush size at around 2%, and I'm just going to create some textures in here initially. I'm definitely going to use some of the highlights, but just to create a groundwork, so anywhere where there isn't a lot of the vibrant green there's going to be some texture in there at least. So I'll just create this first, just a smattering of it, don't need to spend too long on that. I'm not going to do any on this side. Then stay on the same layer. I'm going to probably go straight to my third green along, and again with this same brush at the same settings I'm just going to start adding some edges and highlights for the trees and bushes along here. And remember, it's just catching the light, doesn't have to be equally. Some bits are going to catch the light more, so in this center area I'm just going to have more of an impact to the light than I am on the very edge. I can really go over this section a lot more, and I'll also use a lighter green in a moment, but this is a really quite nice starting vibrant green, and it just separates the different areas a little bit. I think that works nicely. Maybe just something over here too. Let's increase the size up to about 5%, just fill in a couple of details here. Again, it's pretty vague and that's fine. And then back down to the 2%, and again just top edges, create some shapes of this foliage and whatever happens to be growing here. It's a bit big that, so I'm going to put it down to the 1%. Get the edges and highlights in here. Although the brush does a lot of the work for you, you still have to actually go in and do a lot of little details too. So the way that you add this brush texture is important. It doesn't do all of it for you. I'm going to go to this vibrant green now, so it's almost a yellowy green, so it's the 5th in from the left, and on the same setting, so we're still on the 1% size and 50% strength opacity. I'm going to use this now just carefully to pick out some really strong little sunny highlights in and around this foliage. It's really caught the light really vibrantly with this colour. So use it sparingly. You can use it up here as well, just in places it's not only here, but it works well if some of the most warm, vibrant colours are more in foreground. I think it helps. Generally speaking, when you have like atmosphere or atmospheric things, and in this example it's water spray, then the vibrant colours are going to get a bit more subdued in the distance. And when it gets closer to you, they're going to appear, like I say, more vibrant, more colourful, and just a bit warmer. So just break up this, make it look more interesting. A bit more variation, looks good. And then more of it over on this side as well. You know, I'm not spending a long time on any of these individual features. It's more about the building up of texture and effect. And actually you can whiz through these pretty quick and the effect will build up. So the gaps between the light textures are just as important, so don't overdo the light highlights. It is important to leave some bits darker as well. Perhaps I'm going to turn that strength down to about 20%, and I may as well stay on the same layer. I'm just going to tweak, add some of these highlights up into this top section too, because it is going to catch the light, just not quite as vibrantly as there, but it is catching the light. And now I know more where the water is emerging, I can then go into the bits that are in between and just add a bit more of the highlights to those remaining sections. We've obscured some bits with the water, but now we know exactly what is remaining. We can go back in and just tweak them a little bit, give them a bit more sunshine with this vibrant green, and just, yeah, bring it to life a little bit more. And there's a section here that's not got any greenery on yet, so we'll just add a little bit, bring it to life. And same over here. Not all of it needs to have greenery on, perhaps it's more rock, you decide. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to go to my, not the brightest colour, but the next one in, so the 3rd from the right there. And with my soft airbrush set to 10% size and 20% strength, I'm just going to go over this middle section a little bit. I want to subdue it slightly. I don't want it to be as strong in the black. I want this spray and mist to be sort of moving across this whole bottom area and just starting to chip away at some of the dark colours that are there. Just brings it out and brings you in to the scene. Feels like you're merging with it a little bit. Brings it forward. I think that works better. And I'm going to create a new layer, and we've got most of the effects, so we're going to be fine-tuning now. So I'm creating extra layers to build on top a little bit more refinement. So I'm going to go in with the brightest colour that I've got, which is 2nd from the right, and I'm going to use my soft brush set to 2% size at 20% strength. And I'm just going to bring in a little bit of sharpness here and there, so a little bit more clarity and detail. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time going around some of these edges, picking out some of these shapes. So it's just catching the light perhaps in areas, so I'm just creating an edge there and just letting it disappear upwards. I'm going to do the same over here, so it's just got a bit of a sharp edge, and then I'm allowing that to sort of disappear in the forms that are over here as well. There's going to be some bits that just stick out a little bit more prominently in the froth and churn of the water. I can go in and just perhaps even turn it up a bit more, so about 40% opacity. I can just choose to add highlights in some areas more than others. Tap in some extra bright textures. Again, brush down into the 1% even, and then just use this brightest of my colours just to refine little details up in this section. It's on a separate layer, so if you're not happy with any of this that you end up doing at this later point, then it doesn't interfere and destroy anything you've just created. So you can have a little bit of fun with the details, just refine to your heart's content, and like I say, you're not destroying, you're not going over anything you've already done. Do you play around, experiment with some extra sharp details around some of the edges. You can see I'm just adding a little bit more manual texture in areas, sharpening up some of those edges and forms. You know, the brush textures are great to get you so far, but then sometimes you might want to go in there and just control it a little bit more as well. Add your own touch to those textures, control it exactly how you want it to be in some areas. And it's very satisfying to do that. As much as it's nice to have brushes that help you along the way, I personally find it more satisfying to be a bit more in control of some of these shapes. So I can go back in, perhaps turn the brush up a little bit more just to blend those two together. I want the rock that's poking through to be a little bit less, so I've softened them together. And just generally, if I put the size of the brush up to about 4%, just generally quite a bit more brightness up in this section I think would make sense. I'm just going to go back through my layers. So we have layer 2, which was in the background. I'm going to go onto that layer, create another layer above that. Back to my artistic leatherwood brush. Just going to go in with some of these slightly brighter colour. So I'm going to go in with this one, which was the 5th in from the left and the 4th in from the right. And with the opacity set really low at about 5%, I'm just going to go in and press some of these textures a little bit more in the background, just to create a little bit more almost sharpness to the texture, but not really. It's not that visible, but because we blurred it in quite a lot in the background, just going over it a few times with this low opacity creates a little bit more vivid texture almost. Perhaps a little bit more here as well. I think that works. Again, we can blur it in slightly if it's still a bit too vivid. So I'm going to blur it into maybe just to about 6%. That looks good. And then change to my airbrushing soft brush, super low opacity, so about 5%, 2% size, and I can just go in and, just as I was doing in other areas, I can just go in and control that texture a little bit more as well. I don't want to overdo this, but just create some slight anomalies that perhaps the brush itself wouldn't do. Doesn't quite cut it, but with a little bit of random highlights and stuff, you can just really further enhance what the brush will do for you. And maybe you can just pick out a certain area where you want just a bit more highlight in areas. So I'm just doing a series of dashes, and maybe I just want to build in some slight brightness into some of the sections in a more hand created way than the brush alone will do. So it's combinations, and that section now I feel much happier with, so I'm going to continue that technique and effect. And it really isn't very controlled, it's very random, and perhaps I'm just having it a little bit brighter towards the top. So just like we had brightness when we came to the top here, there's presumably a top ledge where all this water is coming from, and so it's going to be just a little bit brighter as it goes off the top of our canvas, and just allowing some broken texture to extend down into all these areas. Even in the darker areas you can add some points of texture too, like this. Doesn't need to be refined or specified at all, it's just a series of dots and dashes, and you're just building it up to create that effect. And then maybe there's some areas where it just condenses together and you get a brighter stripe in the mix. That can work really quite nicely. Maybe one on around the edge, just go over it a few times, build it up, and that can work nicely too. Bit of variation goes a long way. And just for good measure, I can just highlight some of these top almost like cloud shapes a little bit. So I've got some along here. I can just pick out slightly an edge to these, but again, I don't want to overdo it. I'm pressing on quite hard now because I've only got it on 5% opacity, but I prefer to have it on a low opacity. That way I'm not accidentally building something in. I really have to mean it in order to bring it out. I have to mean it, I have to go over it quite a few times to make it appear, which is, you know, means it's a deliberate thing and you don't accidentally add things, which is better. Okay, back up to my top layer again. Where are we? Layer 19. And I'm just going to use my soft brush still, down at the 2% size. I'm going to reduce it back down to about 10%. So some last features, building it upwards now, letting it trail off as it goes higher up. Something like this. And just those extra water little details in the mix here, I think will go a long way. Don't need to do too much of those. I'm not going to change layout, I'm just going to go to my vibrant green. In fact, one back from the vibrant green, I can add it a bit more. And with the soft brush, doesn't matter at this point, I'm going to have it down at 1% anyway, and 30% strength, and I'm just going to go in now, and just like I was doing with the water highlights, I'm just going to manually really control where I want some of this green texture to be emerging still. And it's just some finishing touches at this point. Maybe some more up here, because we didn't really add much in this tree area up here. Maybe even a bit higher, so the lowest part of 2%, just to blot it in areas, something like this. And why not back with a vibrant green again? I do love this vibrant green, so back down to the 1%, just a little bit more in places too, more sparingly in the distance than here, but still it does exist and it is a nice addition. Just final touch, back to layer 17 with the soft brush, back to the, perhaps not the lightest colour, but the one next to it. And I'm going to put it up to about 15% size and down low to about 5%. And I'm just going to add a little bit of this to this section, not too much, just to knock some of those dark colours back from the middle bit. They really will be softened in because of the mist. And that will do. I hope you've enjoyed following along with this tutorial. Make sure to give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe, and also the bell notification if you want to be notified of future tutorials like this. Thanks for watching. See you again soon. Bye for now.